You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
The McDonald's snack wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch snack wrap. Spicy snack wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 225, The Battle About Britain Part 9, The Senior Service. This week, a big thank you goes out to everyone who has chosen to support the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes, roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The Battle of Britain was an air campaign, with the Luftwaffe seeking to achieve its goals over Britain and the Royal Air Force trying to stop it. There were supporting actions at sea and on the ground, but the vast majority of the efforts on both sides were centered around the air campaign. Over the last 4 episodes, the podcast has tracked the evolution of German plans and the evolution of the British defenses against those plans. But this episode will be mostly dedicated to the greatest strength that the British had, the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had long been the pride of the British military and, really, society. It was an institution that dated back centuries and had for most of that time been the greatest weapon and the greatest shield of the British Empire. Looking back on it today, we know that there were some weaknesses, and at the start of the war, it was overstretched with commitments spanning the entire globe. But it remained undefeated. The early war Royal Navy also, I think, gets overshadowed by what would happen in the Pacific after 1941, with the 2 huge fleets of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the American Navy duking it out over thousands of miles of ocean. But the Royal Navy of 1940 was facing a much more varied set of constraints, and was forced to spread its resources and fight a war in the North Sea, and the North Atlantic, and the Mediterranean, and it still needed forces in the Pacific. But also, in 1940, the Royal Navy was the strongest navy in the world, with more capital ships and a greater ability to support them in operations than any other navy in the world. And yes, they would be passed by the Americans and in some ways the Japanese in later years of the war. But the majority of the ships that would bring those 2 navies above the Royal Navy were not completed, and some were not even started in the summer of 1940. The fleet that would win the Pacific War for the United States was not even ordered, really, until the Two Oceans Navy Act of July 1940. Confidence in the ability of the Royal Navy to continue a tradition of defending the high seas was important, and everybody thought that they could do it. Churchill was a Navy man. The government as a whole understood how important the Navy was to British supply lines, and the people of Britain also believed that the Navy would come through, with one Home Intelligence report saying that there was still the widespread confidence in the Navy and that, quote, the Navy will win the war for us in the end. On the German side, and especially among the leaders of the Kriegsmarine, there was a tremendous fear of the Royal Navy and its ability to respond to any invasion attempt. This was because once the invasion fleet left port, it would be vulnerable to attack by the Royal Navy's surface ships, which the Germans simply could not match in number or strength. The big ships, the battleships, the cruisers, the aircraft carriers, they were all a concern because they were larger and more powerful than anything available to the German Navy during the summer of 1940. But the threat was so much more numerous than just those large ships. There were countless destroyers and motor torpedo boats and smaller vessels that would attack the invasion fleet, and in fact were attacking the invasion preparations because they were not waiting for it to sail. For example, on the night of 8 to 9 September, motor torpedo boats attacked Ostend, and a mixed force of cruisers and destroyers attacked Calais and Boulogne. In all 3 cases, their goal was to disrupt and harass the invasion preparations that were occurring in those ports, and they did that. This justified the feeling of vulnerability among the German naval leaders, and their concerns about what might happen in the English Channel if the invasion was actually ordered. But the Germans did at least have the beginnings of a plan for how to counteract the power of the Royal Navy, and much like everything else with the Battle of Britain, it started in the air. While the Luftwaffe's air campaign had several objectives, one of the most important was to reduce the ability of the RAF to interfere with its attacks on the Royal Navy during the invasion. The hope was that once the RAF had been reduced in numbers, the vast majority of the Luftwaffe could be focused on attacking any ships of the Royal Navy that would try to interfere with the naval aspects of the campaign. The Royal Navy was also not waiting for the invasion to occur, and throughout the entire course of the Battle of Britain, the Royal Navy would stage almost nightly patrols and minesweeping efforts throughout the most likely invasion routes. They were not the kind of operations that were publicized or celebrated, and they were far less noticeable than the air battles happening over British cities, but they were always happening. Every night, there was something out there happening. From the side of the RAF, well, they would provide continuous intelligence reports based on overflights of the ports that were known to be where the invasion fleet was being based out of. This would feed information to the Navy and the RAF's own bomber squadrons, which would be active in their efforts to disrupt preparations through nighttime bombing raids. Both the RAF and the Navy also ensured that they were making efforts to provide invasion warnings to each other as soon as any invasion fleet set sail, with the Navy carrying out nighttime patrols by trawlers and smaller vessels just in case anything got through unnoticed. If any of those small ships caught sight of the enemy, they would be able to provide important early warnings at a time when every hour of additional warning would increase the British chances of stopping the invasion. While this coordination was very good, there were challenges that were never fully solved, like what the RAF and the Royal Navy would do to coordinate their efforts if an invasion fleet actually put to sea. The challenge was that Fighter Command was ill-equipped to put in place strong fighter cover over the Royal Navy, as had been shown during the early stages of the Channel War when they had tried to protect the merchant shipping in the English Channel. All of the things that helped intercept Luftwaffe attacks over Britain reversed when the RAF had to approach the French coastline or operate over the English Channel, with distance and time being against the British fighter aircraft rather than against the Germans. This meant that 1/5 of all Fighter Command sorties during the invasion would have had to have been flown over the Royal Navy, due to a combination of flight endurance, distance to patrolling stations, and then required numbers to actually defend the naval forces. This would have put a serious dent in the RAF's ability to perform any other missions. Because of this, Dowding, at the head of Fighter Command, did not really plan to utilize his fighters against the invasion fleet or to protect the British efforts to attack the invasion fleet. Now, naval strike aircraft would be sent against the German ships, whether from Coastal Command, Bomber Command, or the Royal Navy, but Dowding's fighters would mostly stay back, escorting them to the coast and then back to their airfields once they had completed their missions. The theory in all of this was that it was better for the RAF to conserve its strength, rather than using it against naval targets, which, to be honest, they didn't have a great chance of meaningfully impacting. Dowding also wanted to conserve Fighter Command strength for after the invasion occurred, and then once again, the scales had flipped back against the Luftwaffe, as they were flying long distances to try and support the German troops that were already on the ground. By withholding the fighters, Dowding would make the job of the attack aircraft who were sent out to attack the German invasion fleet, well, he made their job more difficult. And as was shown during the Norwegian campaign, and in many instances in the Mediterranean, the Royal Air Force already had a pretty hard time hitting enemy naval vessels. Most of this was down to training and doctrine, with little training and equipment being dedicated to making sure bombs hit naval targets. The good news was that the Luftwaffe was, for the most part, also really bad at engaging naval targets. They had some success against merchant shipping during the early weeks of the Channel War, but there would be a vast chasm between dropping a few bombs on slow-moving merchant ships and, much smaller, more maneuverable naval vessels. This was a major problem because even the smallest of the Royal Navy's destroyers or motor torpedo boats were extremely deadly for the slow-moving invasion groups. It did not take the 16-inch shells from the Rodney or the Nelson to sink a river barge. The 3-inch or 5-inch guns on the much smaller British ships were more than enough. The best option for the Germans would have been to try and destroy the Royal Navy's ability to respond to an invasion before the invasion even started. This would have entailed a major bombing effort against the port facilities in southern England, but This would have required major focus and would have been risky due to the anti-aircraft defenses of those areas. And there was simply nothing that could be realistically done about the Royal Navy's facilities further north. But the real problem was that the Luftwaffe had a massive list of tasks to complete in July, August, and September. Too many for them to get them all done. On the other side, Bomber Command had a much smaller set of targets. They executed many attacks during August and September against the growing mass of German shipping earmarked for the invasion. This would result in almost 10% of the invasion shipping being damaged or disabled at various points during those months. This was a situation where Bomber Command really took advantage of the fact that the German shipping was just sitting there, stationary. They were at their most vulnerable. It'd be way more difficult to hit them once they actually got out into the English Channel. But they were never able to totally destroy the German invasion preparations. And as it appeared that the Germans were pushing forward with those preparations, if the invasion fleet sailed, the Royal Navy was at least partially on its own to do the fighting. But don't worry, they had a plan.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love, starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
The first stage of the Royal Navy's plan was naval mines. Now, I've mentioned mines in previous episodes, but I'm going to discuss them here again, mostly to emphasize their importance to both the British and the Germans when it came to a possible invasion. Both sides had the ability to lay and to sweep mines. That was never a problem. But what was a problem, for the Germans anyway, was the fact that they could not guarantee any level of control of the nighttime water off of either coast. During the dark hours, the Royal Navy were constantly performing 3 different duties in the Channel and then along the British and French coastlines. They were first of all simply patrolling for German ships, using the hours of darkness as a time during which the Luftwaffe had no chance of attacking. The second was the sweeping of German mines to ensure that there were always paths through the German minefields for Royal Navy forces. The third, and most dangerous, was placing mines themselves in the hopes that those mines would find German targets. British mines were placed everywhere. That meant that they were along the coastline, particularly in areas where the possibility of invasion was high. They were also placed far out into the Channel in the hopes of disrupting German shipping as far out as possible. Mines were also placed along the continental coasts, which was only possible because the British mine layers could quickly move along the coast at night, lay their mines at determined locations, and then be back in British ports by the time that it was light enough for a German response. The German minesweepers were more limited in their abilities, specifically because of the patrols of the Royal Navy at night, which made clearing enough of the mines a difficult task. There were some efforts to perform daylight minesweeping operations, and there was some success with the practice due to the difficulties that the RAF and Royal Navy had in interception due to the Luftwaffe. But those operations really just revealed that there were simply not enough German minesweepers to keep up with the number of mines that the British were placing. The minefields would be made up of thousands of mines. For example, the Dover Barrage, which was just one of several large minefields, consisted of over 9,000 separate mines that the Germans would have to deal with in some way before the invasion could occur. And those mines were directly in the path that some of the German invasion convoys would have to take to get to their landing areas. To make matters worse, the British used a variety of different mine types. They had contact mines, which required a ship to run into them. They had magnetic mines that would be set off by the magnetic field of a ship that passed over them. With the mixture of mine types, the large permanent mine barrages, then the randomly sown minefields that would be put in place by British mine layers, it was a very challenging situation for the Germans. There was no easy solution for it. This would have been another area in which the Luftwaffe maybe should have put greater focus in the weeks leading up to the invasion, directly attacking the port facilities that supported the mine operations, which they did do, but maybe they didn't put enough resources towards it. But there's also, on some level, there's probably nothing that the Germans could have done to prevent the mines from being put in place. All they could really do is try harder to take care of them, or at least clear them out of the invasion corridors. For the Royal Navy, in the event of a German invasion attempt, there were multiple phases of operations that would be undertaken to destroy the invasion, hopefully before any German boots were walking on British sand. The commander of the Royal Navy's Home Fleet, Admiral Sir Charles Forbes, commanded the most powerful British ships in the region, but these large capital ships would actually not be the first line of defense. This was because there was concern that if they were committed in the wrong circumstances, they would get chewed up by the Luftwaffe attacks before they could bring their big guns to bear on the invasion fleet. There was also a general understanding that those large ships were probably overkill. Due to aerial reconnaissance and other sources of information, there was a pretty good understanding on the British side of what forces the German Navy would have available for the operation, and that did not include any of their larger capital ships, which at the time were just the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. With those ships removed from the equation, the battleships and honestly even the large cruisers of the home fleet were not strictly required. Instead, the Admiralty developed their plans around using destroyers and smaller cruisers to disrupt the invasion fleet as quickly as possible. This would start with the ships that were based in the ports of southern and southeast England, which were named Nor Command and the Dover Command. There were 7 light cruisers, 32 destroyers, 6 destroyer escorts, and 17 motor torpedo boats in the Nor Command, which would be the first line of defense. Not all of them would be committed to the first operation, but as soon as the signal was sent, various groups of ships would be moved into routes to block likely or confirmed German landing beaches. In the east, around Dover, 2 light cruisers and 8 destroyers would be dispatched immediately, while 5 destroyers were sent out from Plymouth at the same time. Due to their numbers and their strength, the destroyers were key to this operation, using all of the weapons available to them, not just their 5-inch guns, but also machine guns, torpedoes, and even depth charges, with plans to use those anti-submarine weapons against the cables that would be used to tow the unpowered river barges across the channel. The destroyers would also be joined by motor torpedo boats as well as corvettes, all of which were more than enough to cause serious damage to the most vulnerable targets. The Germans were not completely defenseless, though, and as many of the ships of the invasion fleet as possible had been armed with machine guns and anti-aircraft guns for use against British ships. These were 2 and 3.7 centimeter anti-aircraft guns, which would be very dangerous due to their high rate of fire and their ability to severely damage the upper decks of many of the British ships that they would be fighting against. This would be particularly dangerous for the gunners on many of the smaller British vessels, because most of the fighting positions on, say, a British destroyer and smaller ships were unarmored and often simply open air. To try and minimize the possibility of damage, either from the German surface vessels or from the Luftwaffe attacks, the destroyers and cruisers would try to attack at night, but there would be challenges with this plan. Radar was not widespread in the Royal Navy during the early period of the war, and in fact, none of the destroyers had radar installed at this point, which made interception in the dark far more challenging. But even with the difficulty, the British were aided by the predictability of the Germans. They were not hunting agile warships that could be anywhere. Instead, they were tracking slow, unwieldy river barges that would almost be forced to sail in a straight line to minimize their time at sea. This made it much more likely that the interceptions would occur, even in the darkness. If this initial defense did not stop the invasion in its tracks, and there was a real probability that it would, there were more destroyers and motor torpedo boats and corvettes and other vessels for the British in southeast England than the entirety of the Kriegsmarine were going to dedicate to the operation. So it was a real possibility that they could have stopped it in the channel. But if they didn't, and the Germans did manage to get onto the beaches, the next phase of the Royal Navy's response would begin. During this phase, with the exact landing beaches identified, and the German naval forces committed to specific routes and timings in their attempt to keep the invasion forces supplied, the response could be properly planned and operations executed. This would be particularly impactful for the German plans because of the length of time that it would take to move the first waves of the German fighting troops and then their mobile second wave onto the beaches, with some estimates on the German side planning for it to take weeks, as we've discussed in previous episodes. This would give the home fleet time to marshal its forces and execute its very sophisticated plan of throwing everything at the German ships in one big attack. The Royal Navy had many advantages that made this brute force attack more likely to succeed. First of all, they just had more ships, and more powerful ships. The second was that they were not tied down by anything. They were free hunters in a target-rich environment. The third was that the vessels that were the most important targets, the barges and transport craft, were also the most vulnerable. It didn't matter if every single German Kriegsmarine ship survived, because destroyers could not put tanks on the beaches, and that's what the Germans would need to succeed in their invasion. German air power would remain a problem, and in reality, the larger British ships couldn't operate in the channel for long periods of time during the day. But once the invasion started, that didn't matter, because as long as they could execute nightly runs through the English Channel, they could do everything that they needed to do. Once the beaches were set, the positioning of the German transport ships would be well known, and every night, the Royal Navy could cause serious damage to anything that stayed off the beaches. There were strategies that the Germans could have put in place to reduce the effectiveness of these raids. For example, they could have kept the barges away at night, or at least away from the beaches. But that also would have greatly limited the ability of German forces to land supplies, and that achieved the British objectives just as well as actually destroying the barges. A barge stuck in a German port due to fear of the Royal Navy was just as useful to the German forces in Britain as one sitting at the bottom of the channel. And this is before even getting into discussions of British and Allied submarines that would also be in operation in the English Channel. In the long run, these may have actually been more dangerous than the surface ships because they could operate there constantly. Now, while I'm making a big deal about how the Royal Navy would have responded to an invasion, all the strengths that it could have taken advantage of, all of the incredible impact it could have had on the German forces, these were all known issues for the German Navy, and the only real hope they had was that the Luftwaffe's air campaign would degrade the RAF's strength enough that the presence and abilities of the Luftwaffe would provide for some counterbalance to the strength of the Royal Navy. Well, next episode, the air battles in which the Luftwaffe will attempt to achieve those objectives against the RAF will begin, because August 13th, 1940 would be Aldertag, or Eagle Day.